Garda. Welcome to another edition of Blurb TV. We're going to shift from the NFL to college football right now. There's a lot to talk about, of course, in college football. We've got spring practices that just ended, but I wanted to focus on a potential thing that I think we're going to talk about a lot over the next few years, and that's the idea of a superconference. Last week, we heard a little bit about the Pac-10 and the Big 12 potentially merging and making a big TV super contract. Now, this is a few years away. They have contracts until the end of the 2011-2012 football season, but it's not too early to talk about what that impact may be and the likelihood of it. Yes, there are logistical problems with a conference like the Pac-10 all the way on the West Coast merging with, be it the Big 12 or be it all the way out on the East Coast with the Big East or the ACC. But I think that this is something that a lot of conferences are going to talk about over the next few years. Why? Money and national exposure. Now, the SEC kind of is the reigning in both of those categories. The SEC has their two divisions, their big conference championship, and is by and large considered the powerhouse in college football. I'm going to hear a lot from you Big 12, Big 10, Pac-10, what have you, conference people. But the fact is that perception-wise, the SEC is king. How do you combat that? At some point, it's going to have to be getting yourself more national exposure and in some ways more money. And you do that through TV. Now, something like the Pac-10, they play late games. They're on the West Coast. And they've got some perception issues in terms of defense and overall strength of the whole conference that they're going to have to combat. And the best way to do that is to get, earlier games, but more importantly, more national exposure. And they get that by maybe merging, could be the Big 12, could be the ACC. If two conferences, even as far apart as the Big East or the ACC and Pac-10, were to join forces and get a lot more national exposure, I think it would be a very strong statement and make them a lot of money and help their recruiting, help their academic exposure. There are a lot of advantages to it. Now, there are logistics in terms of getting Pac-10 teams from the West Coast to the East Coast, but when you're thinking about it, think about this. Really, these teams aren't going to play each other all that much. Maybe every once in a while USC, UCLA, Cal heads to the East Coast and plays your Rutgers or your Maryland or something like that. 90% of the time, though, both conferences, which would be divisions, would still play within those divisions. And it really wouldn't be until the title game that they'd really cross swords. In other words, you'd have a lot of conversation on either coast about what the other division was doing, but you wouldn't necessarily have to see them play all the time to know what was going on and to get more exposure. And that title game, heck, we know from the SEC that sometimes that title game can be a bigger deal than some of the bowl games that the team that wins goes to. There's a lot of rivalry in between each division, and there's a lot of heat, a lot of fan interest, and a lot of national interest as well. A title game can be a huge boon, both financially and exposure-wise, for a conference. So, be it the Pac-10 Big 12 merger or an ACC Big East merger, as I talked about with Michael Felder over at InTheBleachers.com just a few weeks ago, it's going to generate more interest. It's going to get more people aware of what's going on. And, like I said, bottom line, it's going to make the conference more money. These super conferences, I think, will come down the pike. And it'll probably be two smaller conferences. And once again, as Michael and I talked about, wouldn't shock us if it was ACC and whatever's left of the Big East after the Big 10 picks it apart. But regardless, I think most conferences are going to have to give serious thought about what they can do to increase their exposure nationally and increase the amount of money they're taking in from their TV contracts. I think it's much more attractive to an NBC, an ABC, a CBS, even an ESPN, if they can say, hey, we've got 20 teams that we can pull from for very good games versus we can get 10 or we can get 12. And when it comes down to it, you look at some of these conferences and we know that really only half of them are really good and are going to get a lot of national press each and every year for being in the top 25. So if you double the amount of teams to pull from, instead of looking at 5, maybe 6 teams that are really viable for a top 25 spot and national media attention, maybe you're looking at 10, 12 teams. I think there's a lot of advantages to this, and I think that we're going to hear more and more about it over the next 5 to 10 years, if not sooner. I think especially with the Big Ten expansion, which is going to be announced by the end of this year, you're going to hear a lot of talk about what we're going to do as a conference to survive. It's going to probably start with the smaller conferences, but it will definitely happen. And don't be shocked if some of the bigger conferences have a hand in it as they see that their national exposure and money can go up, even if they're dealing with a conference that right now doesn't have the exposure that they perceive themselves having. So it's going to be a really interesting conversation. We're going to talk a lot about it at thunderingblurb.com as well as a couple other places. So definitely come back to Blurb TV, come back to thunderingblurb.com, check out inthebleachers.com as well, where Michael and the other guys do some great work. And we're going to keep talking about these super conferences because one way or the other, I think Michael shares my opinion that this is the way it's going to go down the road. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you next week with another edition of Blurb TV. Make sure you check me out on thunderingblurb.com, over at Football Guys for your fantasy football needs, and also on Twitter. Just follow me at thunderingblurb. Thank you very much for joining me. Have yourselves a great week.
For more shows, articles, and podcasts like this one, check out thunderingblurb.com.